Hello there and welcome back to the Science Sleepy Minds. The sea is still tonight, barely a ripple disturbs its surface. Somewhere in the distance a buoy rings lazily, and the full moon hangs low over the horizon, too large for comfort, like it's pressing down on the edge of the earth. Salt clings to your lips. Everything feels hushed. You lean against the railing of an old wooden dock and the water beneath your feet begins to shift. Not with wind, not with waves, but with something deeper. Something quieter. The pull of the moon. You probably won't survive this, if you're planning to explain tidal mechanics without at least a tiny existential crisis. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all drift off. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The dock creaks beneath you as the tide begins its slow retreat. It's almost imperceptible at first, just a whisper in the water, but before long, the sea slips away from the shore like a sleepy child pulling back a blanket. The moon hasn't moved much, and yet it's dragging entire oceans along for the ride. No one asked it to. It doesn't ask permission. It just pulls. Above you, the moon shines with that classic ghostly glow, a flashlight held behind frosted glass. But that light isn't what's moving the water. It's something deeper. Gravity. The moon's gravitational field gently tugs on the Earth, but because our planet is squishy in all the wrong places, looking at you, Pacific Ocean, it doesn't just tug the land, it tugs the water. You might imagine the ocean rising into a dramatic, towering swell aimed at the moon like a worshipper. In reality, it's more like someone slowly pressing into a memory foam mattress, soft, silent, and strangely symmetrical. The tide forms two bulges, one on the side of the Earth facing the moon, pretty intuitive, and one on the opposite side which seems to make no sense at all. We'll get to that baffling bit later, so hang tight. For now, walk with me down this moonlit shore. Every step sinks into wet sand that was bone dry just an hour ago. Somewhere off to the left, a fiddler crab eyes you with suspicion, caught between the retreating water and its burrow. And in the distant past, say, the 5th century BCE, a Greek philosopher named Anaxagoras looked up at the same moon and declared it must be connected to the ocean. No proof, just vibes. And oddly, he wasn't wrong. It wouldn't be until the Renaissance, though, that Galileo and Newton started putting math behind the madness. Isaac Newton, in particular, explained that gravity isn't just a downward force, it's a mutual embrace between any two masses. The bigger the mass, the stronger the pull. The moon might be puny next to Earth, but it's close, really close, and in cosmic romance, proximity wins. But here's a sleepy twist. The moon doesn't just pull the oceans, it actually pulls the entire Earth. The solid part, the crust, the rocks beneath your feet. It all moves slightly towards the moon, like Earth is stretching in its sleep. But water, being water, responds more dramatically. It sloshes, it forms bulges. It gets dramatic, like someone who only cries during sad movies but then sobs during the credits. And if you're thinking, wait, doesn't the sun have more gravity? Excellent point. It does. About 27 million times more mass, in fact. But the sun is so much farther away that its tidal influence is weaker than the moon's. Distance dulls even the strongest forces. Now turn your attention back to the harbour. The tide is still pulling out, revealing dark seaweed and little crabs scrambling for cover. A sailboat moored nearby leans at an awkward angle, its hull now resting partially on sand. The moon did that, quietly, without lifting a finger, or having fingers. Historians still argue whether ancient coastal societies truly understood the moon's role in tides, or if they just noticed patterns without knowing the cause. Some Babylonian texts suggest they timed certain rituals with the moon's phases and the movement of rivers. Coincidence? Maybe. Intentional oceanology? Also maybe. In the 11th century, monks in English abbeys were tracking tidal shifts in their manuscripts, noting how they synced with lunar cycles. And long before that, Polynesian navigators learned to read tides with a level of precision that still confounds modern scientists. A half-inch shift in water level, they could feel it in their canoes. Meanwhile, here you are, struggling to find your car keys. Let's get fringe for a second. There's a quirky old belief, still whispered in some corners of the internet, that the moon's gravity subtly influences human emotions, particularly among the water-heavy. You know, people with a lot of water in their astrology charts. Or, more scientifically, people made of 60% water, which is all of us. Convenient theory, huh? But before you start blaming your emotional breakdowns on the waxing gibbous, take a breath. The moon's effect on you directly is negligible. You're not a tide pool, you're just tired. That said, the moon's effect on the collective, on oceans, on animals, on ecosystems, is massive. And it's all happening right now as you lie there, listening to the low drone of your fan and imagining distant seawater lifting gently into the air. The moon isn't doing anything flashy, it doesn't roar. It doesn't sparkle, it just pulls, softly, constantly, like gravity wearing a silk robe. Up above, the moon drifts slightly westward, not because it's actually moving that fast, but because the Earth is spinning beneath you. As you trudge along the sleepy beach, you're also rotating at about 1,000 miles per hour. Just another Tuesday. Let's end tonight's first steps with a little paradox. The tide isn't really coming in or going out. The water is bulging. The Earth is rotating into and out of that bulge. So in a way, it's not that the sea is moving toward you. You're spinning into the moon's embrace and then spinning out again. Like a moody dance partner who won't return your texts. Sleep on that. The air gets cooler as you stroll farther along the beach and the sand grows firmer beneath your feet, compacted by a tide that only recently left this stretch behind. You pause for a moment, staring up at the moon, still hanging there like a porcelain plate in the sky. It doesn't blink. It doesn't shimmer. It just pulls. Tonight, you're walking through an invisible field. The gravitational grip between Earth and Moon that orchestrates the tides like a ghostly conductor. This isn't the type of gravity you feel when you trip on your own shoelaces again. This is a more refined kind of pull. Subtle, specific, focused. See, gravity isn't some blanket force that just drags everything downward. It's a mutual handshake between objects with mass. You pull on the moon just as much as the moon pulls on you, though you probably lose in an arm wrestling match. The moon's effect on Earth is felt most dramatically in the oceans, where water isn't fixed like land. It's free to respond, to stretch, to lean into that lunar handshake like a sleepy waltz. So how exactly does this tug-of-war translate into those mysterious rising and falling tides? Well, imagine the Earth wrapped in an oceanic blanket, very squishy, very deep, and very moody. Now picture the moon pulling on that blanket. The part of the ocean that faces the moon gets tugged toward it. That's your first high tide. Intuitive, right? But here's where your brain might short-circuit slightly. There's a second high tide that forms on the opposite side of the Earth where the moon's pull is weakest. Why? Centrifugal force, baby. Okay, before your high school physics PTSD kicks in, let's break it down slowly. Earth and the moon actually orbit a shared centre of mass called the barycenter, which lies inside Earth but not dead centre. This shared wobble creates a kind of spin, and like any spinning system, it flings stuff outward. It's the same force that makes your laundry slap the sides of the washing machine or sends lettuce flying out of your salad spinner. On the far side of the Earth, the one facing away from the moon, that centrifugal force wins. It flings the water outward, creating a second high tide. So while the moon tugs one side toward it, the Earth's spin slings the other side away. Voila! 2 high tides, 2 low tides, every 24-ish hours. And you're just caught between them, riding a blue marble that's being squeezed and stretched like a stress ball. Now step off the beach for a moment, let's climb a little higher. You walk up the damp slope of a grassy bluff overlooking the bay. Below, water still glistens under moonlight slowly retreating. Every molecule of that water, every droplet sliding past barnacle-covered rocks, is following the moon's invisible leash. But it's not just the ocean that moves. The Earth itself actually bulges under the moon's gravity. We're talking centimetres of movement, but it happens. The ground beneath your feet is breathing ever so slightly with the rhythm of the tide. In fact, during the 20th century, as sensitive seismometers were able to detect these micro-movements, Earth tides, as the solid crust flexed. Not enough to notice with your eyes, but enough to mess with a scientific instrument. Fun, right? You're walking on a planet that's constantly stretching like dough under a baker's rolling pin. Here's a quirky one for your dream journal. In 1970, a Soviet experiment accidentally detected tidal shifts using underground nuclear blast measurements. They weren't looking for Earth tides, they were trying to measure shock waves, but the data picked up slight gravitational wobbles they later traced back to, yep, you guessed it, the moon. So yes, even Cold War physics got tidal. Now, let's ground ourselves a bit. You're back at sea level watching the surf roll in and roll out again. It seems smooth, predictable, rhythmic, like the sea is breathing. And in a sense it is. Tidal shifts are Earth's inhale and exhale, responding to gravity with cosmic timing. Historians still argue whether early civilizations understood gravity's role at all. Did they see the moon as the cause, or just a celestial signpost? Some argue that Babylonian astronomers mapped tide cycles by observing the moon's position, but had no concept of gravitational force. Others think the connection between moon phases and tidal strength, especially spring tides during the full and new moon, was obvious even to early societies. But without the physics to explain it, all they could do was chart the patterns. Still, let's not get too arrogant. Even today, predicting tides perfectly is still a challenge. We know the rules, but the details? That's a shifting puzzle. Water isn't just water. It's influenced by coastline shape, underwater topography, salinity, even wind. It's like trying to guess which way a cat will jump. You might have a good idea, but it's still a gamble. Speaking of gambles, some ancient sailors trusted the tides to guide their ships through narrow inlets and rocky channels. Imagine relying on the moon to decide whether your boat will make it home or become driftwood. No GPS, just lunar cycles, ocean whispers, and a well-worn rope. And the moon? It just keeps orbiting, 238 to 855 miles away, minding its own business, quietly stretching the planet like a baker rolling out pizza dough. You wouldn't think something that far away could shape our daily lives, but here you are, watching it pull the sea from your toes. Pause again, take in the quiet. The waves are slower now, almost sluggish. The tide has shifted. It's about to begin its return. It's subtle, not flashy. Not like a switch flipping, but more like the slow turning of a page in a very old book. You might not notice it at first, but soon it's unmistakable. The sea begins to climb again. So here's where we are. The moon's gravity pulls the ocean into a bulge. Earth's spin creates a pattern bulge. And you, somewhere in between, are floating on a planet that gets squeezed twice a day, every day, like clockwork. Except it's not quite clockwork, is it? It's lunar work. A dance of mass and motion and memory. One last sleepy thought before we drift forward. The same gravitational handshake that moves the tides is also slowing down Earth's rotation. Yup, every year our day gets a tiny bit longer because the moon is stealing our rotational energy. Rude. But we'll come back to that sleepy theft later. For now, you walk back down the beach. The tide is rising, the moon is still watching, and you're starting to feel the pull. The sand beneath your feet is damp and cold now, saturated from where the water lingered only moments ago. You squint toward the surf as it creeps closer again, inching upward like it forgot something. A driftwood log catches the edge of a tiny wave and shifts slightly. You swear you didn't see that wave coming? This is what happens when you start following the bulge. That's right. Tonight, you're tracing the shape of an ocean bulge. One of two, remember. There's one on the side of the Earth facing the moon, and another directly opposite. You're standing somewhere between them now. But these bulges are not just stationary heaps of water. They move, or rather, they appear to move. You see, as the Earth rotates underneath these gravitational bulges, any given point on the planet experiences the tides as if they're rolling in and out. But the bulges themselves, they stay mostly aligned with the moon's position, which means the Earth spins beneath them, like a curious cat brushing past two water balloons. You squish into a patch of soft sand and stare out at the water again, trying to imagine it all from space. There's Earth, rotating once every 4 hours. There's the moon, orbiting once every 27.3 days. And wrapped around this whole rotating globe is the ocean, being pushed, pulled and flung into bulges that are constantly just out of reach. It's like chasing your shadow if your shadow was made of salt water and had trust issues. Each bulge corresponds to a high tide. As your spot on the planet spins into one of these bulges, the sea level rises. Spin out of the bulge, and the water retreats. That's your low tide. Then you spin to the second bulge on the far side, and bam! High tide again. Twice a day. Like a moody water clock that forgets daylight saving time. But, and here's the twist, it's not exactly every 12 hours. Because the moon is also moving in its orbit, each tidal cycle takes slightly longer than a perfect half day. The result? A high tide every 12 hours and 25 minutes or so. That's why your favourite tide pool is just a bit farther up the rocks every day, like it's playing a long, slow game of hot lava with the beach. You might think the oceans would respond immediately to the moon's position, like loyal little satellites of their own. But no, water, despite its best efforts, is a bit lazy. There's lag. In fact, the tidal bulges don't sit exactly beneath the moon. They trail slightly behind, like they're being dragged along against their will, which, let's be honest, they are. This lag is due to something called tidal friction, and it's the reason our days are slowly getting longer. The moon pulls on Earth's oceans, the oceans resist with friction, and that friction pushes back against Earth's rotation. The result? Earth spins just a smidge slower each century. A few milliseconds here, a few milliseconds there. It doesn't sound like much, but over millions of years it adds up. The days used to be shorter, much shorter. We'll visit that little time travel headache soon. For now, let's bring things down to sea level again, literally. You're standing at the edge of the tide, watching the foam swirl around your ankles. The water seems to breathe. Inhale, exhale. High tide, low tide. And through all of it, the bulges keep rolling past like sleepy waves that never break. Historians still argue whether coastal communities in ancient China and Mesopotamia had accurate models for this bulging behaviour, or if they simply relied on observation. Some ancient Chinese water clocks were adjusted based on tidal timing, but whether that was due to understanding the moon's involvement, or just keen pattern recognition, is still up for debate. Now here's a curious oddity to chew on. Some parts of the world only get one high tide and one low tide per day. Places like the Gulf of Mexico are known for this diurnal tide pattern, and it throws off every neat explanation we've just tiptoed through. Why? Because the shape of Earth's continents, ocean basins, and even seafloor topography interfere with the natural symmetry of the tidal bulges. Think of it like trying to play a song on a warped vinyl record. It kind of works, but everything feels slightly off. In contrast, places like the Bay of Fundy in Canada experience tides so extreme, up to 50 feet in difference, that they've been used as timekeepers, energy sources, and the occasional setting for terrifying shipwreck tales. More on that later, of course. But this is your sleepy reminder that the tides are not perfectly consistent across the globe. They're warped, delayed, split, blocked, exaggerated depending on where you are. The bulges try to maintain their shape, but Earth, in all its lumpiness, refuses to play fair. Want a weirder one? There's a place in the Pacific Ocean called the Amphidromic Point, where there's effectively no tidal movement at all. Like, the water just doesn't bulge there. The tides rotate around it like an awkward middle school dance circle, and there are dozens of these points around the globe. If you ever feel like your emotional tides aren't lining up with the moon's energy, just tell people you're an amphidromic zone. Totally normal. Anyway, back to the beach. The moon is higher in the sky now. The wind picks up slightly, lifting your hair and carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. The tide has fully turned. It's no longer receding, it's on the rise. You can see the foam licking farther up the sand, overtaking your earlier footprints, erasing them one by one. This is how it always goes. The Earth rotates, the moon tugs, the bulges stay mostly in place but slightly lagged behind. The oceans stretch toward the sky on both sides of the world, and we all pretend the beach isn't slowly swallowing itself every few hours. Oh, and let's not forget that our friendly bulge dance has side effects. That tidal friction we mentioned. It's not just slowing Earth down, it's also pushing the moon away. Every year the moon drifts about 1.5 inches farther from Earth, which over enough time means no more bulges, no more tides, just a very distant X, floating cold and alone in space. But don't worry, you've got at least a few billion years before you have to say goodbye. Until then, the bulges will keep moving, the tides will keep rising, and you'll keep walking along this moonlit shoreline wondering how a rock in the sky can make the ocean breathe. Watch now as the next wave brushes your toes. The tide is here again. You're still at the shoreline, but the scenery has subtly shifted. The tide, now on its way back in, slinks up this beach with eerie patience, stealing every inch of dry land it can. You sidestep a jellyfish the sea casually delivered like a soggy housewarming gift. And above it all, the moon hovers, silent, still, indifferent. But it's not the only one involved in this nightly shuffle. Time to give the sun some credit. Yeah, that overachiever. The one lighting up your whole planet, feeding your food, heating your skin, and ruining every vampire's day. Turns out it's also a part-time tide generator. You tilt your head and squint at the sky. Trying to remember whether it's currently night or early morning doesn't matter. Somewhere on the other side of the planet, the sun is flexing its gravitational influence. And while its tidal effect is only about half as strong as the moon's, it's still powerful enough to warp oceans and stir up the waters. Here's the thing, the sun, despite being absurdly massive, like 27 million times the mass of the moon, is also absurdly far away. That distance dulls its gravitational pull just enough that the moon gets top billing in the tidal drama. But when the sun and the moon align, they form a kind of gravitational double team. That's when things get spicy. We'll get to those dramatic spring tides soon enough. For now, understand this. The tides you feel beneath your toes are the result of two celestial forces, not just one. The moon might be the diva, but the sun? It's the secret backup dancer making the whole show pop. And let's not forget that the sun's gravitational field isn't a static thing. As Earth orbits around it in its slightly elliptical path, the distance between us and the sun fluctuates. So even its tidal effect varies slightly over the course of a year, just enough to mess with the spreadsheets of every marine biologist trying to have a stress-free vacation. Now, walk with me inland just a little. You find a quiet tidal creek, slowly reversing direction as the water begins to return. Tiny fish dart upstream, instinctively following a rhythm that's older than language. The plants along the banks seem motionless, but they too are responding to the gentle rise. This is where the sun and moon start playing tug-of-war, sometimes working together, sometimes at odds. Their positions in the sky, relative to each other and to Earth, can either amplify or weaken the tides. When they align on the same side of Earth during a new moon, or on opposite sides during a full moon, their gravitational pulls combine. That's when tides go big. That's when you get spring tides. Spoiler. Spring tides have absolutely nothing to do with the season. They come from the Old English word springan, meaning to jump or rise. And that's exactly what the tides do. Jump higher than usual. High tides are higher, low tides are lower, and everyone in coastal towns checks their flood insurance. Then about a week later, when the sun and moon form a right angle, with the Earth in the middle, their gravitational forces start cancelling each other out. This creates the opposite effect. Neap tides. These are the chill ones. Low highs, high lows. The ocean equivalent of meh. You could nap through them. And honestly, you probably should. Historians still argue whether ancient mariners understood the sun's role in tides or just blamed the moon for everything. There's some evidence that Polynesian and Arab navigators were aware of more complex lunar solar cycles, but in Western Europe the sun's tidal involvement wasn't formally noted until much later. Even Galileo tried and failed to explain tides using Earth's motion. Ignoring the moon and sun entirely, smart guy, terrible oceanographer, let's slip in a fringe tidbit before the tide gets too far ahead of us. Ever heard of lunar effect theories where full moons are blamed for spikes in emergency room visits, crime, and weird pet behaviour? Some people stretch that idea to include tidal changes, suggesting the moon's pull might subtly affect our biology. Studies remain inconclusive. Skeptics say it's nonsense. True believers say, yeah, well, explain my cat then. Meanwhile, back at the beach, the surf is beginning to sound louder. The tide is getting serious now, club curling higher up the sand. A child's forgotten toy boat is swept off a tide pool ledge and into the open sea, never to return. Probably off to start a new life as a pirate ship. You glance back at the moon and realise it's no longer alone in the sky. Faint streaks of orange and gold paint the horizon, the first hints of sunrise. The sun is entering the scene again, ready to throw its gravitational weight around. And here comes a fun plot twist. Solar tides aren't just boring understudies. They actually have more influence during certain times of year, particularly when Earth is closest to the sun, what we call perihelion. That happens around early January. So, depending on the season, the sun might be a little stronger in the tidal game than usual. You might not notice it on your casual beach stroll, but scientists tracking millimetre-scale changes in tide levels? Oh, they notice. They always notice. The moon, however, remains the reigning queen. Always closer, always more influential, always just a bit mysterious. It doesn't care what season it is. It doesn't care if you're ready for high tide. It just pulls, constantly, patiently, like a sleepy giant dragging the oceans behind her like a satin robe. And remember, these gravitational influences don't act on a blank canvas. Earth is messy. You've got continents in the way, underwater ridges, shelves and basins. These features scramble the tidy pull of moon and sun into a chaotic waltz that only mostly follows the rules. It's like trying to dance ballet in a bouncy castle. Graceful, kind of, predictable, not really. As the surf climbs higher and the sky brightens, you take a deep breath. The moon is fading into the blue now, overpowered by morning. But her work isn't done. Even in daylight, the tides obey her call. She may be out of sight, but she's never out of influence. So next time you watch the tide roll in, remember, it's not just the moon. The sun's in there too, flexing from afar. Together, they're stretching the ocean, reshaping coastlines, and quietly reminding you that nothing on Earth moves entirely on its own. Even your dreams, perhaps, are a little bit lunar. You pause at the edge of a small tide pool, watching as the water begins to tilt ever so slightly in a direction your eyes can barely detect. It's almost like the surface tension itself is hesitating, uncertain whether to stay or flow. There's a strange rhythm to it, a silent pulse moving under your feet, and you realise this isn't just about gravity anymore. It's about spin. The Earth, after all, is not standing still. Right now, you're rotating eastward at nearly 1,000 miles per hour, unless you're lucky enough to be near the poles, in which case you're spinning a bit slower, like the lazy edge of a carousel. Either way, you're turning, constantly. And this spin doesn't just blur sunsets or mess with airplane flight paths. It shapes the tides in ways that make gravity look like it's only half the story. Welcome to the weird world of centrifugal force, the invisible sensation you get when your car makes a sudden turn and your fries slide across the dashboard. On a planetary scale, centrifugal force helps explain why the Earth is slightly squashed at the poles and bulged at the equator. And yes, it helps explain why one of those pesky tidal bulges ends up on the side of Earth opposite the Moon. Here's the sleepy version of what's happening. The Earth and the Moon aren't just two objects locked in a one-sided relationship. They're orbiting a shared centre of mass, a spot called the barycenter, which lies about 1,000 miles beneath Earth's surface, closer to the side facing the Moon. Imagine spinning around while holding hands with someone heavier than you. You'll both wobble a bit. That's the Earth-Moon dance. Because of this dance, everything on Earth is subject to a kind of outward flinging motion, centrifugal force that acts opposite the Moon's pull. On the side of Earth, farthest from the Moon, this outward force dominates, causing the water there to bulge outward too, even though it's being pulled less by the Moon. That's why you get two high tides. One because the Moon pulls, one because the Earth spins. This is where things start to feel wobbly. You're walking on a planet that's essentially being stretched into an oblong, water-covered football. Except the football is constantly sinning, lurching slightly as it orbits the sun, and occasionally tripping over mountain ranges. It's not all neat symmetry either. Those tidal bulges don't just sit perfectly on either side of the Earth like polite guests. Because of Earth's spin and friction with the seafloor, the bulges actually lag behind the Moon by several degrees. They're constantly trying to catch up like exhausted runners chasing a lead they'll never reclaim. Historians still argue whether ancient astronomers understood the role of Earth's rotation in all this. Most early models assumed the heavens revolved around a fixed Earth, so tides had to be caused by celestial moods or divine meddling. It wasn't until Newton came along that we started to frame the tidal system as a complex interaction between gravity, inertia, and spin. Even then, he admitted the math got a little slippery when continents entered the picture. Let's add a fringe fact while we're spinning in circles. There's an idea, floated more for fun than academic rigour, that if Earth suddenly stopped rotating, the tidal bulges would go wild. Oceans would slosh dramatically toward the poles or stagnate depending on your location. Some parts of the planet would become oceans, others deserts. Don't worry though, it would also mean you'd be flung forward at 1,000 miles per hour. So, not your problem for long. Back at your tide pool, you notice how the water isn't just sloshing in and out. It's shifting sideways too, curling around rocks, nudging toward the ocean. That's the spin again. Earth's rotation also gives rise to something called the Coriolis effect, which causes moving water and air to veer off course. It's why hurricanes spin, and why ocean currents don't just move in straight lines. And yes, it affects tides too. In the northern hemisphere, water curves slightly to the right, in the southern, to the left. This subtle twist means that tidal waves, those slow massive movements of ocean water, not only move in and out, but often spiral around ocean basins in large looping patterns called amphidromic systems. Remember those weird spots where tides don't change much? This is why. The tide's energy is spinning in a giant circle around them, like water around the drain, but way, way slower. Picture that next time you're falling asleep. Massive loops of ocean turning silently beneath satellite eyes, driven by the moon's pull, Earth's spin, and a few billion years of inertia. And somewhere in that chaos, a crab is just trying to get back to its rock. As the sun rises higher and the tide reaches its midday lull, you sit on a dry patch of beach, watching the waves smooth out like ironed silk. Everything feels calm for now, but you know it won't last. In a few hours, the water will retreat again, pulled back by the bulge chasing you around the globe. And remember, it's all about perspective. You think the tide is coming in? Really? You're just rotating into a bulge. Think it's going out? You're rotating away. The water isn't running toward you or away from you. It's staying in place, stretched by forces far above your pay grade, while you spin in and out like a bewildered carousel rider who didn't read the safety instructions. By the way, those forces, they are not done with you. Because of the way Earth spins and the way those tidal bulges lag behind the moon, there's a subtle exchange of energy happening every moment. Earth's rotation drags the bulges forward, and those bulges pull back on the moon. That tug slows Earth's spin and pushes the moon farther away. A game of cosmic push-pull, where the prize is a longer day and a more distant moon. If that sounds sad, don't worry. It's an extremely slow breakup. The moon drifts away at roughly the same rate your fingernails grow, so unless you plan to live another billion years, you're fine. Still, think about what that means. Long ago, really long ago, days on Earth were much shorter. Scientists believe that during the Devonian period about 400 million years ago, a day was only about 22 hours long. Ancient corals even show growth rings that support this, like trees, but soggier, and way older. So as you yawn and stretch into your own sleepy rhythm tonight, remember this. You are spinning through space at terrifying speeds, dragged forward by a slowing Earth, beneath a moon that's drifting away, and you're perfectly safe. The tides will still come and go. The sea will still breathe, and all because of gravity, inertia, and a dance that never quite syncs up. The sun now hangs confidently in the sky, scattering its golden light across the water, like it's trying to outshine the moon's earlier performance. Waves roll gently toward the shore, their rhythm hypnotic, each one echoing the slow pulse of the planet. You sit for a while, tracing the motion with your eyes, and somewhere between the lapping surf and the sea breeze, it dawns on you. This happens twice a day, every day. High tide, low tide, and then back into go, like clockwork. Except, as always, it's messier than that. Let's peel back the sleepy illusion of simplicity. Most places on Earth experience what's called semi-diurnal tides. That means 2 high tides and 2 low tides every 24 hours and 50 minutes or so. But not everywhere. You see, the tides are less like a neatly ticking clock and more like your phone's autocorrect. Mostly right, often baffling, and occasionally wildly unpredictable. Thanks, Moon. But let's stay with the classic case for now. In a perfect world, with a uniform ocean and no pesky continents, you'd experience one high tide when your spot on Earth rotates under the moon's gravitational bulge, then a low tide 6 hours later as you rotate out of it, then another high tide when you swing around to the opposite bulge, and so on. That's the basic loop. High, low, repeat, eternally. Or until the moon gets bored and floats off into space, whichever comes first. But hold on, if the Earth rotates once every 24 hours, why does the tidal cycle take 24 hours and 50 minutes? Ah yes, the sleepy time-stretching secret. The moon is orbiting Earth in the same direction that Earth spit, so each day the moon has moved slightly farther along in its orbit, and Earth has to rotate a little more than one full turn to catch up and face the moon again. That extra 4 minutes delays everything, your high tide, your low tide, your attempt to eat lunch without a wet picnic blanket. So now, those 2 high tides and 2 low tides are just a little off each day. Not only do they shift later over time, but their height can vary too. One high tide is often higher than the other, something called a diurnal inequality. And that's not even the weird part. Some places, like the Gulf of Mexico, don't get 2 high tides at all. They get one, a single lonely high tide followed by 1 low tide every day. That's called a diurnal tide, and it's usually caused by the unique shape of the ocean basin, where the natural resonance of the water doesn't allow 2 full bulges to form properly. Think of it like a bell that only rings clearly once per swing instead of twice. Meanwhile, in other regions, like parts of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, things get really chaotic. You might get 2 high tides and 2 low tides, but hey, they're all at different heights. That's a mixed semi-diurnal tide, and it's exactly as disorganised as it sounds, like trying to clap on beat at a jazz concert. You think you've got it, then suddenly everything syncopates and you look confused in front of your sea anemone friends. And of course, humans had to make it more complicated. Historians still argue whether medieval tide tables were truly scientific or more like glorified guesswork. In some European port cities, harbour masters relied on crude mechanical clocks tied to chains and floating markers to keep track of the tides, many of which ignored the moon entirely and just followed the patterns by rote. In Venice, for example, they used tide gates and predictive tables hundreds of years ago, which sometimes worked and sometimes left people ankle-deep in canal water when the moon had a temper. Let's drop in a little fringe oddity while we're here. There's a persistent belief among some fishers and surfers that tides don't just affect water levels, they influence luck. More fish at the incoming tide, fewer at the outgoing. Are the fish actually riding gravity waves into the shallows, or are humans just projecting their anxiety onto the ocean again? Scientists have yet to land on a firm answer. But hey, if the sea gods want to gift you a bonus sea bass now and then, who's arguing? Meanwhile, the Earth just keeps spinning. You feel it, even if you don't. Underneath you, that 24-hour rotation hums along, dragging you through each tide cycle like a reluctant shopping cart with one bad wheel. And the moon? Always a little ahead, always a little off, like the friend who's somehow both early and late to every lunch. Now let's talk timing. Since the tidal cycle shifts by about 50 minutes each day, that means if high tide is at noon today, it'll be around 12:50 tomorrow, then 1:40 the next day, and so on. Eventually it'll loop back around. But if you're trying to plan your beach day based on yesterday's perfect tide pool moment, well, bring extra towels and maybe a snorkel. And what does this cycle feel like? Well, if you were a tiny crab, and for this moment let's pretend you are, you'd spend your day scuttling between zones of wet and dry, warm and cool, predator and safety. Twice a day the sea would crash over your home and then vanish, exposing you to the elements. The rhythm of life would depend entirely on the moon's mood. You wouldn't need a clock. You'd feel the pull in your legs, in your shell, in your antennae. Even for land-based life, tides matter. Beach ecosystems thrive on the predictability of wet and dry, in and out. They've adapted to the slow heartbeat of the moon's pull. The timing may shift, but the pattern holds. And you stretch your legs, stand up and brush the sand off your clothes. The tide is on its way out again. Low tide this time. Soon the sea will expose more of its secrets, rocks that shimmer, shells half buried, seaweed glistening like spilled paint. You step closer, watching your reflection shimmer in the shallows. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the water whispering in a language too slow for human ears. The tide is never still. It's always in motion, always pushing and pulling with invisible hands. Twice a day, every day, not because of some magic spell, but because you live on a sphere that spins and sways through gravitational ballet. Somewhere across the world, the next high tide is rising. And you're just waiting for it to come back around. The tide is low now and the beach has opened itself like a sleepy book, wide, worn and full of strange little notes in the margins. You walk across it slowly, passing tangled seaweed, discarded shells, and the occasional horseshoe crab flipped the wrong way, legs waving in awkward distress. Somewhere nearby, a seagull laughs. Ooh, this, right here, is a quiet intermission between the more dramatic acts of the tidal cycle. But don't be fooled, something big is always coming. And when the moon and sun really decide to work together, the ocean stops playing and starts roaring. Let's talk about the drama queens of the tidal world. Spring tides and neap tides. Despite the name, spring tides don't have anything to do with springtime. There's no seasonal floral theme, no pollen, no allergies, just a linguistic leftover from the Old English word springan, meaning to rise, leap, or burst forth, which frankly is a lot more accurate. Spring tides happen twice every lunar month during the new moon and the full moon, when the Earth, moon and sun are arranged in a straightish line. That's called syzygy, by the way, a truly delightful Scrabble word. When this alignment happens, the gravitational pull of the moon and the gravitational pull of the sun team up like over-caffeinated toddlers. The result? Tides that are extra. High tides climb higher, low tides fall lower. The range of tidal movement gets exaggerated like a drama student at their first audition. You're probably picturing massive towering waves now, but that's not quite how it works. These aren't tsunami-level events, we'll save that for another section. The sea just stretches itself a bit more, like it's trying to impress someone watching from space. The difference might be a few extra feet of water, or several meters in more extreme regions. But when you live in a flat coastal area, those extra feet are the difference between quaint boardwalk stroll and emergency canoe ride to the grocery store. And just when the moon and sun finish their duet and drift out of alignment, something gentler steps in. Neap tides. Neap tides occur when the sun and moon form a right angle with Earth. Picture it like a cosmic elbow. During these times, the moon's pull and the sun's pull are working against each other. Not fighting exactly, just giving each other the silent treatment. The result is smaller, more modest tidal ranges. High tides are lower than usual. Low tides aren't as low. It's the introvert of the tidal cycle. Quiet, reserved, excellent at avoiding confrontation. Neap tides happen during the first quarter and third quarter moon phases. These are the lunar phases that look like perfect half moons, though technically you're seeing exactly half of the lit side. The moon's always showing half its face, you're just catching different angles, like a celestial influencer curating its glow. Now here's a fun side quest. You might not realise it, but these lunar alignments also subtly influence things like the height of groundwater, tidal river flow, and even sediment transport. During spring tides, more debris gets pulled out to sea. During neaps, it settles. The very shape of the shoreline, the sandbanks, the channels, the places where fish gather and boats get stuck. All of it depends on this quiet, 2-week rhythm of gravitational geometry. Historians still argue whether ancient coastal dwellers could reliably track these spring and neap patterns, or if they just responded to the symptoms. There's evidence the Minoans, back around 2000 BCE, timed port schedules and harvest festivals with full moons and high tides, but whether that was intuition or calculation is still unclear. The ancient Egyptians, meanwhile, aligned parts of their irrigation systems with lunar phases, not just for the Nile's floods, but for subtle tidal shifts in the river's delta. Coincidence? Or were they onto something? Let's drop in a fringe theory before we forget. Some esoteric traditions, and yes, a few modern pseudoscience newsletters, believe spring tides have an energetic effect on human emotions, and the idea is that when the sun and moon align, so do our internal tides. Cue full moon madness, new moon intention setting, and a suspicious increase in yoga classes. Science remains skeptical. But if lighting a candle at high tide makes you feel grounded, hey, who's judging? Back on the beach, you pause at the edge of a wide, flat expanse of sand that was underwater just hours ago. The sun is bright now, but the moon, though invisible in the daytime sky, is still doing its quiet work, pulling at the oceans, reshaping the coast with the same rhythm it's kept for billions of years. You remember that the strongest spring tides occur during a perigee spring tide, when the moon is not only new or full, but also at its closest point to Earth in its elliptical orbit called perigee. That can lead to tides that are even more exaggerated than usual. Some coastlines see flooding during these events, even on clear days. Scientists call this sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding, which sounds like something caused by a neighbour's sprinkler, but is in fact a growing climate concern. In contrast, the weakest neap tides happen during apogee, when the moon is farthest from Earth. Combine that with a quarter moon and you get tides that are downright lazy. The ocean barely bothers to rise. Honestly, kind of relatable. As you wander farther down the beach, the signs of spring and neap tides start to stand out. You notice lines of seaweed, one higher up, one lower. Those are the rack lines, marking the edge of high tide at different times. During spring tides, the rack line is pushed higher, often tangled in dunes and driftwood. During neaps, it lingers farther down, like a shy guest who didn't want to climb the stairs. You crouch down and run your fingers along a shell buried in the sand. It's been polished smooth by countless cycles of tide. Springs and neaps, fulls and quarters. The shell doesn't care which moon is showing or whether the tide is big or small, it just waits. And so does the ocean. Because whether it's pulled high in a spring tide or kept quiet by a neap, the sea always knows the moon will return. And the sun, too. Together they stretch and release, rise and fall again and again, one dramatic, one reserved. both constant, and you, caught in the middle, just trying to keep your feet dry. The tide is in retreat again, lazy, reluctant, like someone hitting snooze on a Monday. You follow its slow crawl down the beach, where miniature rivers carve wiggly paths back to the sea. There's something soothing about this part, the in-between, not the crash of waves or the stillness of low tide, but that shifting, uncertain motion. The ocean, briefly, doesn't seem sure what it wants. That's the thing with tides. They don't behave exactly how you think they will. Even with all this talk of gravity and orbital alignments, the real tides down here on Earth can get pretty unpredictable. Why? Because water may follow the moon, but it also follows rules. Rules written by friction, geometry, depth, wind, and the inconvenient placement of continents. It's a wonder the tides manage to happen at all with how much interference they get from the landscape. See, the water doesn't just slosh toward the moon and slosh back like an obedient puppy. It has to navigate around the coastlines, continental shelves, underwater mountains, and wildly uneven basins. It's like trying to do a waltz on a dance floor covered in Lego bricks. Painful, confusing, and definitely not graceful. As the tide tries to rise and fall in response to the moon's pull, the water often gets delayed, redirected, or even completely blocked. Some places experience the tide several hours after the moon has already passed overhead. This delay is known as the tidal lag, and it's one of the many reasons why the water doesn't always line up perfectly with lunar position. In fact, the actual wave of a tide, called a tidal wave, though not the terrifying tsunami kind, moves around ocean basins like a slow ripple in a giant misshapen bathtub. The rotation of the Earth adds a spin to this wave, creating complex patterns that don't simply move east to west or north to south. They swirl, they spiral, they bump into continents and ricochet like a bowling ball in a poorly designed alley. Imagine dropping a pebble in a bathtub full of jelly, with a fan on one side and a sponge on the other. That's roughly the level of complication happening in places like the Pacific Ocean. You walk along the edge of a lagoon now, watching the tide trickle through a narrow inlet. The water hesitates at the mouth, piling up slightly as it tries to squeeze through. This bottleneck effect can cause some very odd tidal behaviour. In fact, some areas experience something called a tidal bore, a sudden, often dramatic wave that rushes upriver when the incoming tide surges into a narrow channel or estuary. It can be several feet high and moves upstream like a watery freight train. The Amazon River has one of the largest tidal bores on the planet, known as the Pororoca. It can travel for dozens of miles inland and is even surfed, yes, surfed, by brave souls with waterproof health insurance. Imagine your regular river suddenly deciding it's a tsunami. Not terrifying at all. Historians still argue whether ancient engineers understood these localized tidal phenomena well enough to build around them. The Indus Valley civilization over 4,000 years ago had tidal docks with gates that seemed to suggest they knew something. But did they truly understand how lunar cycles affected the flooding of their harbours, or were they just very good at trial and error? The debate rages on, and quietly in academic journals you'll never read while falling asleep. And here's a juicy fringe tidbit. There's a conspiracy theory, you knew one was coming, that claims certain ancient megalithic sites, like Stonehenge or the temples of Malta, were built to not just track the sun or moon, but the tides themselves. Proponents say the positioning of certain stones aligns with extreme tidal events. Mainstream archaeologists roll their eyes, still. It's a romantic idea, that our ancestors might have been building monuments to the sea's subtle heartbeat. Meanwhile, you pause by a rocky outcrop, noticing how the tide has pulled away from a small tide pool. Inside, anemones pulse lazily, hermit crabs bump into each other like distracted shoppers, and fish the size of your thumb dart for cover every time your shadow moves. It's a miniature world that only exists between tides, a brief window when life can breathe before the water comes crashing back. These intertidal zones are among the most dynamic habitats on Earth, precisely because the tide never gives them peace. Twice a day they're submerged, then exposed, then submerged again. Anything living here has to survive both wet and dry, hot and cold, still and storm. It's like living in a house that floods and bakes every 12 hours, and somehow life thrives here. Tenacious, adaptable, and just a little weird. Kind of like us. And not all water obeys the moon's call in the same way. Some bays and inlets have what's known as resonant frequencies, kind of natural rhythm based on their shape and depth. If the tidal frequency matches this natural resonance, you can get amplified tides much higher than normal. The Bay of Fundy, for example, has tides over 50 feet tall in some areas, largely because its geography traps and enhances the incoming tide like a megaphone for water. Other places, like the Mediterranean Sea, barely register tides at all. The narrow entrance from the Atlantic limits how much water can flow in and out, so while the moon's still doing its thing, the local geography politely ignores it. And then there's the weather. Yes, weather. Because just when you think tides are a nice, neat interaction between celestial bodies and salty puddles, along comes wind, air pressure, and storm surge to ruin your models. A strong wind can pile up water on a coastline, masking the natural tide or even reversing it. A low-pressure system, like a hurricane, can raise sea levels temporarily, making a high tide even higher. That's when you get king tides, those once-in-a-while super tides that sneak up and flood your favourite seaside taco stand. So here you are, trying to make sense of all this. The moon pulls, the earth spins, the sun joins in, the water responds, but also gets distracted, pushed around by continents, wind, and its own emotional baggage. The result is a tide that mostly follows the rules, occasionally forgets them, and sometimes writes entirely new ones just to keep things interesting. And yet, through all this complexity, you can still watch the sea rise and fall like breath. You can still set your watch by it. You can still fall asleep to the rhythm of waves sliding over sand, even if you now know those waves are being nudged, spun, and redirected by forces stretching across 93 million miles. The tide is low, but already you can feel the shift. The water hesitates, then begins its slow return, back through the inlet, over the rocks, toward the tide pool, toward your toes. The ocean is never still, and neither is the moon. You wake from your daydream, or was it a tide dream, as the water touches your feet again. Not much, just a gentle nudge, like the sea reminding you it never really left. The sand is wetter now, darker, clingier. You take a few steps back, watching the tide advance in its quiet, unhurried way. But something's different here. It takes a moment to register, but you feel it. This isn't just a tide coming in, it's being redirected. You've wandered to a coastline where the ocean's grand planetary choreography gets completely disrupted. The culprit? Continents. Big, immovable, irregular slabs of land that absolutely ruin the moon's smooth, symmetrical plans. If Earth were just a globe covered in uniform ocean, the tides would be easy to predict. 2 high tides, 2 low tides, evenly spaced and gently rolling around the world. But Earth, bless it, is not that kind of polite dinner guest. It's a bumpy, broken dinner table with mismatched chairs, half a tablecloth, and someone spilled soup in the Atlantic. Let's take a step back and imagine the big picture. The moon tugs at the ocean, creating those familiar bulges, one facing it directly, and one on the opposite side, courtesy of centrifugal force. Now imagine trying to drag those bulges around the Earth like blankets, while dodging entire land masses. That's what the tides are up against. Every coastline is a roadblock, every continent a detour. That's why tide patterns vary wildly depending on geography. It's not the moon's fault, it's the continents, slicing up the ocean into awkward basins and shallow shelves, each with its own tidal quirks. The Pacific behaves differently from the Atlantic. The Indian Ocean does its own thing entirely, and the Arctic? That's a whole mood. You take a slow walk along the shore as the incoming tide curls around a jagged rocky outcrop. Here, instead of flowing directly inland, the water diverts sideways, swirling into little whirlpools near a steep cliff. This is where the ocean gets weird. Because water, like a person trying to find the best parking space, doesn't always go straight. It takes the path of least resistance, even if that path loops back on itself. Ever heard of rotary tides? Probably not, but they're happening right now beneath your feet. When the tide enters an ocean basin, like the North Sea or the Gulf of Mexico, it doesn't just slosh in and out, it rotates. In the northern hemisphere, it usually spins counterclockwise. In the southern hemisphere, clockwise. This spin, influenced by Earth's rotation and something called the Coriolis effect, causes the high tide to slowly march in a circle around a central point where there's almost no tidal change at all, the amphidromic point. Yes, the one we joked about earlier. Still weird. You can think of it like a giant lazy Susan made of water, only instead of snacks, it's got billions of tons of seawater swirling around a pivot point. Most of the ocean moves in response to this rotation, and the closer you are to the amphidromic point, the smaller the tides. The farther away you are, the more dramatic the difference between high and low. So now, walk with me to the Bay of Fundy. It's far away from the amphidromic point, and thanks to its long, narrow, funnel-like shape, it creates some of the most extreme tidal ranges on Earth, up to 50 feet in difference between high and low. It's as if the moon looked down at that coastline and said, "Yes, there, let's get theatrical." Historians still argue whether the Mi'kmaq people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Bay of Fundy, intentionally timed their seasonal settlements to the tide's extremes, or if their deep respect for the water simply grew from long familiarity. Either way, they knew how to read the land and the sea. Modern developers still struggle to build around these powerful tides without flooding roads, buildings and docks. And yet the Mi'kmaq managed it with birch bark and bone. Now, let's check in on a fun fringe fact. In certain parts of the world, including the Cook Inlet in Alaska and the Severn Estuary in England, the incoming tide rushes in as a visible wall of water, a tidal bore we mentioned earlier. But what makes these places special? Yup, geography. Narrow, shallow river mouths plus strong tidal forces. It's just the right angle equals a bore that travels miles inland, sometimes even reversing the river's natural flow. Salmon get confused, so do kayakers. Even without bores, tidal chaos is everywhere. Let's look at strangely timed tides, places where high tide happens not when the moon is directly overhead, but hours later. Why the delay? Because water can't teleport. It takes time for the tidal wave, this planetary-scale bulge of water, to travel around the edges of continents, through narrow channels, and across vast stretches of ocean. The result is a kind of lunar jet lag. You're not standing under the moon when the tide comes in, you're standing under a coastline that just got hit by a wave that started under the moon a few hours ago. It's like receiving a letter in the mail that says the moon called, you're wet now. Now, if you were to stand on the west coast of Africa and the east coast of South America, you might expect the tide to hit both at the same time. After all, they're directly across from each other on a nearly continuous stretch of ocean. But nope, thanks to underwater ridges, basin shapes and the Earth's rotation, the tides may hit hours apart or even behave completely differently. One coast might get a spring tide while the other gets something oddly subdued. And don't get me started on islands. Some islands, like Tahiti, experience very small tidal ranges because they're close to an amphidromic point. Others, like the British Isles, are stuck in the middle of several overlapping tidal systems, which can make predictions wildly inconsistent. A sailor in Liverpool might watch the tide rise dramatically, while someone in Dover a few hundred miles away sees almost nothing at the same time. And if you're on an island where the tides rotate around you clockwise, congratulations, you now live in a place where time bends and sea level follows an invisible spiral. So what does this all mean for you standing here in the gentle surf? It means the ocean is less like a giant bathtub sloshing back and forth, and more like a cosmic jelly being jiggled in slow motion by a moon with a very particular set of skills, and a lot of obstacles in her way. The continents don't care about the moon's plan, they redirect, delay, distort. They trap water in bays and estuaries, enhance it in some places, cancel it in others. They're the reason your beach vacation in Nova Scotia includes a massive tide chart and a timer. But the moon still pulls, the water still tries to follow, even when the path is anything but straight. The beach has changed again. You barely noticed it happening, but now the water laps at a different spot, and the sun, higher in the sky, glints off distant whitecaps. Something about the light feels ancient. You stare out over the shifting sea and realise, with a twinge of awe, that this rhythm, this ceaseless pull and release, has been happening for billions of years. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, long ago the tides were wilder, louder, more violent. The moon was closer, Earth spun faster, and the ocean danced like it was trying to throw the planet off its axis. Welcome to the prehistoric tides, the era of chaos. Let's go back, way back. About 4.5 billion years, give or take a poorly labelled calendar. Earth has just had a catastrophic collision with something roughly the size of Mars. Scientists call it Theia, which sounds like a goddess but behaved more like a wrecking ball. The impact blasted debris into space, and over time that debris coalesced into our moon. Or at least that's the leading theory. Historians still argue whether it was a single impact, multiple smaller ones, or some bizarre spin-off event involving molten donuts of magma. Either way, the moon was born out of violence, and it started off very close to Earth, like 15,000 miles close. Today it's about 239,000 miles away. You do the math. With the moon that close, its gravitational pull on the oceans was immense. Scientists estimate that tidal ranges back then may have been 10 times higher than they are today. Imagine that. Oceans rising and falling by hundreds of feet twice a day. Entire coastlines would have been flooded and exposed in a matter of hours. You think the Bay of Fundy is impressive? Try dodging a megatide every 12 hours with no dry socks. Earth itself was spinning faster too. A full day used to last just 6 hours. That means the tidal cycle, the time between high and low tide, was just 3 hours. Imagine that pace. The oceans rushing in and out every few hours, carving the land, stirring the soup of chemicals that would eventually become life. This intense tidal activity may have done more than just flood rocks and annoy trilobites. It likely played a critical role in the evolution of life itself. You see, all this chaotic motion created intertidal zones, those shifting areas where water meets land and then vanishes again. These zones are brutal but fertile. Life here has to adapt fast, evolving ways to cling, crawl, hide and dry out. Many scientists believe that the earliest life forms may have evolved in these unstable tidal zones. The constant change forced early cells to learn resilience, to transition from water to land, to get weird. Some even argue that tides were essential for triggering certain chemical cycles that led to the formation of RNA, the molecular precursor to life as we know it. Pools filled, dried, filled again. Molecules got concentrated, then baked in the sun, then mixed again. Life didn't just spring up in some warm, still pond. It got kicked into existence by tides with attitude. You walk past a tide pool now and pause. It's just a shallow bowl of water, barely 2 feet across. But it could be a tiny echo of those ancient zones, a reminder of where we came from. Crabs skitter, algae wave lazily. Somewhere in that water, life began with a splash and a shove. Let's drop in a fringe tidbit while we're swimming in deep time. Some researchers believe that if the moon hadn't existed, or if it had been smaller, life on Earth might never have developed at all. Without strong tides to mix nutrients and challenge early organisms, evolution might have stalled. Earth might be a sterile blue rock, just spinning quietly with no one here to watch it. But because the moon was once so close, and is still close enough, the tides have been shaping this planet from the start. And not just the sea. The moon's pull, combined with tidal friction, is slowing Earth's rotation even now. It's subtle but real, about 1.7 milliseconds per century. That adds up. Fossilized coral from 400 million years ago shows daily growth rings, like tree rings but saltier, that indicate there were about 400 days in a year back then. That means Earth's days were shorter and the years slightly longer. The coral didn't care, it just kept growing. You imagine standing on a Cambrian coastline watching a sunrise come and go in 6 hours, then again and again. No time for breakfast, no time for anything. The tides rushing past like subway trains with no brakes. It must have been dizzying. And loud. Tidal forces back then could have triggered more tectonic activity, causing the plates to shift more violently. Some researchers propose that tidal flexing, especially with a closer moon, may have even helped drive early volcanism, releasing gases that formed the early atmosphere. So yes, the tides might have helped breathe the air into existence too. Over time, though, things calmed down. The moon slowly drifted away, about 1.5 inches every year. Earth's rotation slowed. The tides mellowed. Civilization got a chance to build sandcastles without them being instantly vaporized. Historians still argue whether ancient cultures knew the moon was moving away. Some scholars claim that certain myths, like in Babylonian or Polynesian tradition, describe the moon pulling away from the sea or growing small. Symbolic? Coincidence? Or a poetic echo of some long-term observation passed down through oral history? Hard to say. Back in the present, you look up at the moon. It's not full tonight, but it's still watching, still pulling, still shaping, and you know it won't always be this way. Billions of years from now, the moon will be too far to keep the tides going as we know them. Earth will be tidally locked, showing the same face to the moon forever. The dance will end. The ocean will fall into a long, sleepy stillness. But that's a story for another night. For now, the moon is still close enough. The tides still come, and every wave lapping your ankles is a whisper from the ancient past. When the earth spun fast, the moon hung low, and the sea roared like it remembered something important. which maybe it still does. You've wandered inland now, just far enough to let the wind dry your toes and the salt crust onto your skin in delicate crystals. The tide is still on the rise behind you, creeping toward where you sat an hour ago. But you're not here for the waves this time. You're here for the people who watched them, measured them, memorized them, prayed to them, feared them, because long before modern science scribbled equations onto chalkboards and launched satellites into orbit, the tides were clocks. And if you lived by the sea, especially in the days before quartz watches and atomic timekeeping, you needed that clock. You settle into the sand near a weather-beaten stone pier, half buried in dune grass. The kind of place where ancient sailors might have tied up their boats when the tide was right, if they were lucky enough to guess the course correctly. Tides aren't just a curiosity, they're a calendar, a timer, a warning bell. And for much of human history, getting the tide wrong wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, because of course the cradle of civilization had something to say about the moon and water. The Babylonians, brilliant with astronomy, left behind tablets that track the synodic month, the time between full moons, with surprising accuracy. Historians still argue whether they truly understood the connection between the moon's phases and the tides, or if their records were more about lunar calendars and religious rites. But if you look at their texts sideways and squint, you'll find some tantalizing hints. In China, things were more direct. As early as 200 BCE, Chinese texts describe systems that linked the tides to lunar cycles. Fishermen and traders along the Yangtze and Pearl rivers would plan trips based on tide books, scrolls that showed when the river would rise enough to carry goods or let them cross safely. These weren't just guesses, they were observations, passed down for generations, refined by experience. And then there were the Polynesians, navigators who, with nothing more than stick charts and starlight, crossed entire oceans. They read the water like a language. The tide told them when to launch, when to land, when to move the village uphill. Their understanding wasn't wrapped in math. It was woven into songs, stories, rituals. In some oral traditions, the moon is described as pulling the sea like a mat, a poetic way to describe gravity if ever there was one. You brush your hand through the sand, uncovering a tiny shard of pottery. Imaginary, of course, but let's play along. Somewhere, a Roman port worker once buried something like it. The Romans were meticulous about tides, especially in places like Ostia, the port of ancient Rome. They built harbour gates to trap high tide water and keep ships afloat during low tide. Engineers like Vitruvius even wrote about the moon's influence, though their models were clunky and inconsistent. Still, they knew the timing mattered. Imagine you're a monk in a 9th century Irish monastery. You're in charge of maintaining the tide table that's carved onto the stone wall beside the chapel door. Every day you mark the tide's turn with a scratch or a symbol. The bell rings at vespers, but you're watching the sea. The tide tells you when the pilgrims can land, when the fishermen can launch, when the Vikings might come. It wasn't always precise, but it was reliable enough. In some places, the church itself became the clock. Monks at Mont Saint-Michel in France planned their prayers around the rise and fall of the tide. The abbey sits on a rocky island that becomes cut off from the mainland during high tide. Miss the timing, and you're stuck. Or worse, swept away. Even today, you can visit and watch tourists nearly stranded by the rushing sea, just as monks once did centuries earlier, with lanterns in hand and Gregorian chants echoing off the stone. Let's toss in a quirky tidbit for good measure. In medieval England, there was a belief that certain saints could control the tides. Fishermen would light candles and leave offerings to St. Nicholas. Yes, that Nicholas, he got around, or St. Cuthbert to hold the water, just long enough to dock. Did it work? Probably not. But when your ship and your life depend on the sea, a little extra help never hurts. The real innovation came when tides moved from intuition to prediction. In the 11th century, Al-Biruni, a Persian polymath, wrote about the moon's influence on tides in remarkably modern terms. He even noted the delay between the moon's position and the actual tide, what we now understand as tidal lag. His observations were careful, mathematical, and centuries ahead of his time. Fast forward to the 17th century, and things really take off. With the help of telescopes and the growing power of mathematics, scientists like Galileo, Descartes, and Newton all took a stab at explaining tides. Galileo, oddly enough, got it wrong. He tried to attribute tides to Earth's motion around the sun. It wasn't until Newton, with his law of universal gravitation, that the moon finally got the credit she deserved. And then came tide tables. By the 18th century, British naval officers relied on published charts showing the exact times of high and low tides at major ports. These charts were based on years of observation and some pretty brilliant math. In 1833, an Englishman named William Whewell created the first comprehensive global map of tidal behaviour, including amphidromic points. He also coined the term scientist. By the way, busy guy. But the real game changer? The tide predicting machine. Built in 1872 by Sir William Thomson, aka Lord Kelvin, it used pulleys and gears to calculate tidal cycles based on harmonic analysis. It looked like a steampunk octopus and could predict tides with remarkable accuracy, decades into the future. One of these machines even helped plan the D-Day landings in World War II. Because as always, the tide waits for no one. Back at your imaginary pier, the tide has nearly returned to where it started. A few gulls hop around, picking at whatever the sea decided to leave behind. And somewhere in a dusty room, a tide chart flips to the next page. A digital tide gauge beeps quietly. A satellite watches from above. The moon still pulls, the sun still tugs, and we, clever creatures with our calendars and clocks, still follow. Because long before we counted seconds, we counted waves. Before we mapped stars, we marked the wet line in the sand. And before we understood time as something to wear on our wrist, we understood it as something that rose and fell twice a day, just like the tide. The tide has fallen again, leaving behind a new landscape of exposed rocks, glinting puddles, and creatures that only existed in this in-between world. You crouch near a tide pool and watch a crab sidestep under a curtain of sea lettuce, claws raised like it's both shy and ready to fight you. Behind it, something small and silvery darts beneath a rock. Blink, and it's gone. This isn't just a temporary refuge. This is a whole world, crafted by gravity and governed by water's mood swings, and every creature you see, every limp sea star, every barnacle crust, but every sleepy snail clinging to wet stone owes its life to the moon. Because tides don't just shape land, they shape life. You're standing in what biologists call the intertidal zone, the area between high tide and low tide. It's a brutal neighbourhood. You get flooded, then baked, soaked in salt, then dried to a crisp, tossed by waves, hunted by gulls. It's like living in a house where the roof disappears twice a day and predators can fly. And yet, besides, millions of species thrive here. Let's start small. Barnacles. These crusty little weirdos look like boring white pebbles, but they're actually animals, glued headfirst to rocks, feeding with long feathery legs that sweep food from the water. They open only during high tide and close up tight when the water retreats, like little medieval castles with moats that come and go. Then there are mussels, clumped together like gossiping neighbours, secured with silky threads that rival spiderwebs in strength. During high tide, they filter seawater for plankton. During low tide, they clamp shut, holding moisture inside like it's precious, which, in a way, it is. You peek beneath a rock and see anemones, their tentacles withdrawn into tight, sticky knots. When submerged, they bloom into underwater flowers. When exposed, they look like abandoned bubble gum. Beauty and beast, all in one. This tidal lifestyle creates a kind of biological clock, a lunar calendar of behaviour. Animals here don't just react to tides, they live by them, feed by them, reproduce by them. Take the grunion, a small fish native to the Pacific coast of North America. These little show-offs wait for the highest spring tides of the month, then literally beach themselves to lay eggs on land. They wiggle onto the sand, spawn in a flurry of silver scales, then vanish back into the waves. The eggs stay buried until the next big tide comes 2 weeks later and washes them back out to sea. It's synchronized spawning, moon approved. And then there are the horseshoe crabs, ancient and armoured, older than the dinosaurs. Every spring, under the light of the full moon, they crawl ashore in massive numbers to mate, their movement perfectly timed with the highest tides. Coastal birds, especially red knots, travel thousands of miles just to feast on the resulting eggs. One lunar tide, one massive feast, one epic migration. Historians still argue whether ancient societies truly recognised the biological connection between tides and reproduction. There's some evidence that Pacific Islander fishing calendars noted fish behaviour linked to moon phases, and early Japanese scrolls described certain shellfish appearing only during specific tides. Was it scientific insight or just centuries of careful observation? You already know the answer, probably both. Let's add a fringe story here, one of those odd little footnotes from marine biology. In the 1960s, Researchers studying plurlo worms in the South Pacific discovered they emerged en masse from coral reefs to spawn during specific moon phases, not just during a full moon, but during a particular hour of a particular lunar month. How do they know the timing? No one's entirely sure, but the locals, they've been harvesting them for generations. The tide, the moon, the worms, it's all part of the recipe. But you don't need to go exotic to see tidal timing in action. Take a walk near any rocky coast and you'll notice zonation. Bands of different organisms stacked vertically along the shore. Near the top, where the tide barely reaches, you'll find limpets and lichens. Lower down in the splash zone come the barnacles and periwinkles. Still lower, mussels, seaweed, crabs. Each level represents a creature's tolerance to exposure. It's like a vertical map of lunar influence. And they're not just passive residents either. Many of these animals have internal clocks, circadian and circalunar rhythms that sync up with the moon. They anticipate the tides before they arrive, adjusting their behaviour accordingly. Oysters open and close their shells on a roughly 12.4-hour cycle, even when kept in total darkness. Shrimp grow restless when the moon is full. Even in laboratory tanks where no light reaches them, it's not superstition, it's cellular memory. Written in DNA by eons of tidal rhythm. You sit quietly now watching a bird, an oyster catcher, stride across the flats, stabbing its long orange beak into the mud in search of clams. It doesn't need a tide chart. It knows this is feeding time, just like the moon knows it's pulling the ocean again, inch by inch. The connection between life and tides is so profound that scientists now use tidal patterns to track animal populations. Disrupt the tides by building harbours, dredging channels, or raising sea walls, and whole ecosystems collapse. Creatures that rely on predictable wet-dry cycles lose their breeding grounds. Fish vanish, birds disappear, the sea stays but the rhythm breaks. And yes, that includes us. We may not live in tide pools, but we still follow cycles of sleep, of mood, of biology that echo the moon's pull. Some studies suggest hospital birth rates rise slightly during full moons. Others note spikes in emergency room visits or psychiatric episodes during spring tides. The science isn't settled, but the fascination lingers. Maybe deep down we remember what it was like to live by the sea, to need the tides. Even now, in a world ruled by Wi-Fi and bullet trains, people still plan their lives around tides. Surfers chase high tide swells, clammers wait for the lowest lows, sailors consult tide charts before casting off, and kids, they chase the retreating waves like they're chasing the moon itself. The tide turns again. You feel it before you see it. A slight shift in the air, a change in the sound of the surf. The water is returning slow and confident. The creatures of the intertidal zone prepare for their next act. Barnacles open, anemones unfurl, crabs emerge from the shadows, tiny soldiers ready for battle. The ocean doesn't forget. The moon doesn't miss a cue. And life, in all its squishy, scuttling, tentacled forms, answers the call, just like it always has. The tide has turned again, of course. It always does. You watch as the water creeps back over the sand, reclaiming ground it seemed to have abandoned just hours earlier. Seaweed that once lay limp now floats gently in place, lifting with the slow inhale of the ocean. A few leftover shells tumble in the shallow surf like clumsy ballet dancers trying to stay on beat. But not everything returns with the tide. You step onto a stretch of rocky coast, where shipwrecks sleep beneath the waves, and ghost stories whisper through the mist, and because tides, for all their elegance and predictability, have a darker side, and mariners, especially the old ones, knew it all too well. Tonight you're visiting the graveyard of ships, not a metaphorical one, an actual stretch of coastline known for pulling vessels to their end. There are many such places, scattered around the world like cautionary notes in the margins of the moon's music. The graveyard of the Atlantic off the coast of North Carolina, the black coast of South Africa, the reefs of the Philippines, the coast of Nova Scotia, and of course Goodwin Sands in the English Channel, perhaps the sleepiest, spookiest stretch of all. Why? Because tides are powerful, yes, but also tricky. They don't just rise and fall, they create currents, stealthy rivers within the sea, that can drag even experienced sailors into danger. These tidal currents don't flow in perfect lines. They bend, twist, split around islands, accelerate through narrow straits, and spin off into whirlpools. When the tide turns, these currents can reverse direction in just minutes, often with astonishing force. Now imagine you're a sailor in the year 1602. No GPS, no engine, no weather forecast, just canvas sails, gut instinct to and a shaky understanding of tidal charts that might have been copied from a monk's journal 20 years ago. You try to time your approach to harbour with the tide, but you misjudge. The current shifts, the moon laughs. Suddenly your ship is being pulled sideways into a hidden sandbank, or worse, a jagged reef just beneath the surface. You shout, you drop anchor, you pray to St. Elmo, but the tide doesn't stop. It keeps flowing like a quiet assassin in silk slippers. That's how thousands of ships were lost. Not to storms, not to pirates, but to the tide doing what it always does without politis and without mercy. You might think this is just old history, tales of wooden ships and foghorns, but no, even now in the age of radar and sonar, ships still fall victim to tidal timing. A freighter enters a channel 5 minutes too late and finds the water too shallow. A yacht anchors peacefully, only to discover at low tide that it's lying on its side in the mudder, waiting like a beached whale for the moon to lift it again. Historians still argue whether certain ancient disasters were tidal in nature. Take the loss of the Spanish Armada in 1588. While storms were the official culprit, some scholars believe poorly timed tidal entries into unfamiliar waters played a role. Ships grounded, scattered, caught in currents they didn't understand. It wasn't just the wind, it was the pull of a moon 238,000 miles away. Let's drift into a fringe tale, shall we? In Cornwall, England, locals speak of a ghost ship that appears only at low tide, its masts barely visible through the fog, its bell ringing even though the rigging is long gone. Some say it's the Lady Lovibond, wrecked in 1748 after a jealous lover steered it straight into the Goodwin Sands during high tide. The story's likely fiction, but sightings persist, especially around full moons when the spring tides are strongest. Coincidence? Or a residual echo of human emotion trapped in tidal memory? You walk a little farther now, following the curve of a bay where the remains of a wooden hull lie half buried in the sand. Not far off, a rusted anchor juts out of the water, like a skeletal hand. The tide laps against it gently, indifferent to the wreck, indifferent to your footsteps. And yet, you can't help but feel it. The tide isn't just water. It's time, folded and unfolded over and over again. Every wreck is a marker, every beach a record, every current a line in a song that began before we had language. Some places like the Mont Saint-Michel causeway in France are famous for their rapid, dangerous tides, described in old guidebooks as coming in as fast as a galloping horse. That might be a slight exaggeration, but only slight. Tourists who dawdle too long have been rescued, some airlifted, after underestimating how fast the water can return. Even now, emergency services train for these moments. Lifeguards read tide tables like scripture. Harbour masters keep spreadsheets and alarms. Coastal towns mark safe paths with tall poles, visible even when the path itself is underwater. And every ship captain knows you never argue with the tide, you can only wait. But let's flip the coin for a moment. Tides can take, yes, but they also give. Some ancient ports depended entirely on tidal timing to operate. In the Thames River, ships would wait at the estuary for the incoming tide to carry them upriver toward London. Sails down, letting the moon do the hard work. In Venice, narrow canals filled and emptied on a lunar clock, and goods moved with the ebb and flow like blood in a living city. In the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel, farmers used the tides to flush fields, naturally irrigating pastures that have been cultivated for centuries. In Japan, clam-digging festivals still coincide with the lowest spring tides, ancient rituals now celebrated with smartphones and buckets shaped like cartoon bears. But always, always someone miscalculates. And when they do, the sea doesn't scold, it doesn't scream, it just rises. You look back toward the water, it's almost at your feet again. That wreck you passed minutes ago is now half submerged. Another hour, and it'll vanish completely, tucked beneath the waves like a secret the moon keeps forgetting to share. You don't speak, there's no need. Because here, in the graveyard of ships, everyone knows you don't own the tide, you don't control the sea, you simply try to time your visit before it decides you've stayed too long. The tide is high again, and the wreck behind you has vanished, swallowed up by the sea like it was never there. Only a few ripples remain, swirling lazily around the place where that rusted anchor stood moments ago. You step back just too slightly, as the water nips at your shoes, like it's testing your balance or your nerve. But now, let's do something reckless. Let's imagine the unimaginable. What if the moon were gone? No slow drift into the distance. No quiet farewell over geological eons. Let's just snap our fingers and poof, the moon is no more. Maybe it exploded. Maybe it floated away. Maybe aliens took it to use as a stylish lampshade. Doesn't matter. The moon vanishes, and now the question floats in the air like sea mist. What happens to the tides? Short answer, they collapse. The tides, as we've come to know them, rely almost entirely on the moon. It accounts for about 2/3 of tidal activity, with the sun pitching in the other third like a part-time intern. Without the moon's gravitational pull, those elegant twin tidal bulges on either side of Earth would deflate like sad water balloons. Instead of 2 dramatic tidal shifts per day, we'd be left with a single, much weaker tidal cycle, driven only by the sun. And while the sun is mighty, its extreme distance dilutes its effect. The result? Tides would be less than half their current height. Predictable, yes, but boring. Coastal ecosystems would be thrown into quiet chaos. Picture your favourite tide pool. Without the moon, it never fully drains, never fully floods. The oxygen exchange slows, the rhythm breaks, crabs get confused, anemones talk, fish go looking for somewhere with a little more drama, and entire food chains start to wobble like a table with one leg missing. Now pull back. Think of estuaries, wetlands, mangrove forests. All of them rely on the regular flooding and draining caused by tides. These places act like planetary kidneys, filtering water, trapping sediment, buffering coastlines against storms. Without the moon, those floods become mild swells. The wetlands shrink. The mangroves lose their anchor points. Salt water stops moving where it used to, and fresh water stops flushing what it should. It's like the Earth forgets how to breathe. But let's keep going. Because the moon doesn't just move water, it also helps regulate Earth's tilt. Our planet doesn't spin perfectly upright. It leans at about 23.5 degrees. This tilt gives us seasons, and the moon acts like a gravitational stabilizer, keeping that tilt from wobbling too much. Without it, Earth becomes a bit of a drunk spinning top. Over thousands, maybe millions of years, our axial tilt would start to shift wildly. Sometimes Earth might lean only a few degrees, giving us mild seasons. Then it might tilt as far as 45 degrees, creating wild climate swings. Imagine the Arctic baking in subtropical heat while the equator suffers a dry freeze. Ice caps melting, regrowing, melting again, ecological whiplash. And the tides, still weak, still confused, just like the weather. Historians still argue whether any ancient myths reflect knowledge, or fear, of a disappearing moon. Some cultures describe the moon as a hunted animal, others as a guardian that must be appeased. One Polynesian legend tells of the moon sinking into the sea and being reborn. A symbolic cycle maybe, but also a haunting idea. What if even then people sensed how fragile the balance was? Let's dive into a quirky fringe theory while we're here. There's a subset of speculative thinkers who believe that the moon's presence isn't just natural, necessary, even intentional. That life on Earth wouldn't be possible without the moon's tidal regulation, and that its size and distance are too perfect to be coincidence. They call it the rare moon hypothesis, and while it's not exactly mainstream science, it does make you pause. The moon stabilizes our tilt. It drives our tides, it lights our night sky, and it even helps shield Earth from asteroid impacts, acting as a cosmic punching bag. It's a lot of responsibility for something that doesn't even have an atmosphere. You walk along the shoreline now, trying to imagine it without a tide, without that gentle rise and fall. The water would just sit there, a little windblown, a little bumpy, but still. No swirling tide pools, no great migrations timed to the moon, no whispered retreat of water across the sand, just a static sea. Beautiful maybe, but unnerving. Fisheries would collapse, entire economies would flounder, quite literally. Ports designed around tidal cycles would suddenly become too shallow or too deep at the wrong times. And the cultures built on tidal wisdom, lost, because the tide isn't just a force of nature, it's a cultural memory. In Japan, tide watching is a form of poetry. In the Bay of Bengal, tides dictate the rhythm of daily life. In Wales, people still refer to tide times the way others talk about lunch. Without the moon, that collective understanding, the shared human experience of the tide, would vanish too. And here's the thing, it wouldn't vanish all at once, it would fade. Slowly, unsettlingly. First, the ocean would feel off. The tidal currents would weaken. Certain coastal species would start to decline. Sandbars would shift in odd, unpredictable ways. Boats would get stuck or drift too far. Scientists would scramble to remap the seas. then the cultural knowledge would start to erode. Kids growing up without meaningful tides wouldn't learn to time their games with the sea's retreat. No more counting rack lines, no more springtide festivals. The moon would still hang in the sky, if it were still visible at all, but its influence would be nothing but memory. And eventually, maybe, we'd stop watching the water. That's the saddest part. Not that the ocean would be still, but that we'd stop looking for its movement. Stop listening for the quiet rhythm that's been there since Earth had oceans to move. But you're lucky. You're still here, and so is the moon. Still pulling. Still pacing. Still humming its song through the salt and spray. You turn back toward the sea. The tide has reached its peak again. The waves kiss your toes with just enough cool to make you step back and smile, because the moon is still here, and the ocean still listens. You're walking again, this time along a seawall that wasn't here 100 years ago, and probably won't be here 100 years from now. To your left, the tide laps gently against concrete. To your right, the land rises. Neighbourhoods, power lines, coffee shops with biodegradable straws and a faint whiff of sea salt in the air. It all looks steady, but it's not. Because while the moon hasn't changed much, the ocean has. Welcome to the not-so-sleepy part of our story, the future of the tides. You already know that tides are dictated by gravity, planetary motion, the shape of the oceans, and the position of the moon. But here's something Earth has added to the mix in recent decades. Climate change. That's right. We've introduced a wild card to the moon's millennia-old routine. And the tides, they're responding. Let's start with the most obvious. Rising sea levels. As polar ice melts and ocean temperatures climb, sea levels are creeping higher. Combine that with regular tidal cycles and you get something new and a little unnerving, called compound flooding. Imagine this. The tide is high as usual, but then a storm rolls in. The storm brings rain, the storm brings wind. The storm pushes water onto land, where the tide has already made everything vulnerable. The result? Flooded streets, submerged basements, even fish taking casual tours through downtown areas. Now add spring tides to the mix, you remember those, when the moon and sun align and pull the ocean a little higher than usual. These naturally occurring tides are now amplifying flooding in coastal cities, even on days with no storms and no rain. Scientists call it sunny day flooding or nuisance flooding, but it's not very sunny or quaint if your car floats away during brunch. And it's happening right now. In places like Miami, Bangkok and Jakarta, city streets are flooding with increasing frequency during full moons. Not because of bad drainage, but because the ocean is literally creeping higher under the influence of predictable lunar tides, stacked on top of human-induced sea level rise. It's a tag-team event, and the moon has no idea we've rigged the fight. You pass a sign warning of tidal flood risk. It's permanent now. Not a seasonal notice, not a one-off, just part of life. High tide used to be a thing you checked for surfing or clamming. Now it's part of disaster planning. Still, let's not be all doom and gloom. Let's talk adaptation. In the Netherlands, for example, tides have always been a central concern. The Dutch have lived with the sea for centuries, building dikes, seawalls, and more recently, smart barriers that respond to changing water levels. Rotterdam is home to the Maaslandkring, a pair of massive gates that can close off a harbour from storm surges and high tides in under 2 hours. Think of it as a hinge the size of the Eiffel Tower, floating patiently just in case. Other cities are looking at living shorelines, replacing concrete barriers with natural features like oyster beds, mangroves and marshes that can absorb tidal energy and reduce erosion. These ecosystems not only protect land, but create habitats for wildlife. It's the moon's dance, choreographed with a little help from biology. Historians still argue whether ancient civilizations fell in part due to tidal shifts and rising waters. The city of Dwarka, off the coast of India, is one such mystery. Some believe it was swallowed by the sea thousands of years ago, the victim of rising tides or shifting plates. Similar stories come from submerged ruins in the Mediterranean and even parts of Southeast Asia. Were they flood myths, literal history, or a warning we're only just starting to hear? Let's dip into a fringe concept while we're wading here. Lunar terraforming. Some futurists have suggested that if Earth's tides become too chaotic, if sea levels rise too high, we might one day attempt to artificially adjust the moon's orbit. You know, just casually tweak it, bring it closer or push it farther. Maybe build satellites that mimic its gravitational pull, Don't worry, it's wildly theoretical and terrifyingly risky. The sort of idea that belongs in sci-fi novels and poorly budgeted disaster movies. But still, the fact that we're even considering it speaks to how serious tidal impacts could become. Back to the present. You pass a group of teenagers doing a beach cleanup. Their trash bags are half full of seaweed, half full of plastic. A few yards away, a smart tide gauge is mounted to a pole, sending data to satellites, which beam it to a cloud server somewhere, where it waits to be analysed by a researcher who probably drinks too much coffee and mutters to themselves about sea level anomalies. The ocean has always been monitored, but now it's being watched, modelled, predicted, reshaped. The moon hasn't changed, but our shorelines have, and will continue to. Some models project that by 2100, sea levels could rise by 1 to 3 feet depending on carbon emissions. That may not sound like much, but it only takes a few extra inches to turn a minor tide into a major flood. Entire island nations like Tuvalu and Kiribati are already planning for possible relocation. Their tides, once simply a rhythm of daily life, now mark the timeline of a vanishing homeland. And still the moon pulls, indifferent, consistent. You can't blame her. She's just doing what she's always done. It's we who've changed the shoreline, the atmosphere, the rules. You pause at the edge of the seawall. The tide is starting to fall again, receding slowly, revealing littered sand and seafoam outlines of where it once reached. In a few hours, the cycle will repeat. But you can't help wondering how many more times? How many more tides before cities must redesign themselves? Before coastlines redraw their boundaries? Before the moon's gentle tug feels less like a rhythm and more like a reminder? But maybe there's comfort in knowing the ocean still moves, that the moon still pulls, that no matter what we've changed, gravity hasn't ghosted us yet. The future of the tides isn't written in stone, it's written in policy, in design, in climate models and innovation, and, most of all, is written in adaptation, because the moon isn't going anywhere. But we'll have to decide how we move with the water. You've moved farther down the coast now to a spot where the sea isn't just scenic, it's strategic. Out here, the shoreline is marked not with lighthouses and piers, but with long metallic arms stretching out into the waves. You hear a low mechanical hum beneath the cries of gulls, and something about it feels different. Like the tide is no longer just coming in on its own, because this isn't just coastline anymore. This is the testing ground for an idea as old as humanity's urge to harness the wind or trap the sun. You're standing in the age of the artificial tide. Well, not entirely artificial. We can't make the tide. Yet. But that hasn't stopped scientists, engineers, and the occasional overly ambitious billionaire from asking, what if we could manipulate it, control it, bend it, just a little for our own use? It's an ancient question, really. Humans have been redirecting the flow of water for millennia. Think of the canals of Mesopotamia, the aqueducts of Rome, or the rice terraces of Asia. But those were local tweaks. With tides, we're talking about planetary forces. Still, that hasn't stopped people from trying. Let's start with tidal barrages. You stroll up to a large concrete structure stretching across a narrow estuary. It looks a bit like a dam, because it is. But instead of holding back a river, this barrage is built to catch the tide. When the tide rises, water flows into the estuary. At high tide, gates close. Then, when the tide starts to fall, the stored water is released through turbines, generating electricity. Simple, elegant, and entirely dependent on the moon's punctuality. The most famous example, the Reims tidal power station in Brittany, France, built in the 1960s. Still operating today, it was the first large-scale attempt to capture the moon's power and turn it into watts and volts. Not bad for a celestial body made of rock and loneliness, but there's a catch, of course there is. Tidal barrages mess with ecosystems. They change the natural flow of water, disrupt sediment transport, confuse fish, and sometimes flood nearby wetlands. You might get green energy, but you might lose a stretch of habitat in the process. That's why more modern approaches prefer something subtler, underwater turbines. You pass one now, though you'd never know it. It's deep below, spinning slowly, turned by the moving tide just like a wind turbine in the sea. These machines sit on the seafloor or are anchored to floating platforms, harvesting the kinetic energy of tidal currents without damming anything up. They are part of a field known as tidal stream energy, and it's one of the most promising ways to tap into the moon's work without breaking everything else in the process. Clean, predictable, and nearly invisible. Ideal traits for both marine infrastructure and introverts. But let's rewind for a moment. Because before we ever tried to power cities with the tide, we tried to power villages. Back in medieval Europe, tidal mills were a thing, seriously. Engineers would build small dams on coastal inlets, creating mill ponds that filled during high tide. Then, as the tide went out, the stored water flowed through a water wheel, grinding grain for the local bakery. You got your bread and the moon paid the bill. Historians still argue whether these early tidal mills were more widespread than river mills, but archaeological remains in England and France suggest they were more common than you'd think. In some cases, remnants of these ancient mills are still visible at low tide, timber posts half buried in the mud whispering about barley and lunar scheduling. Let's sneak in a fringe concept here. Synthetic moons. No, seriously. A few space engineers, and possibly one or two sci-fi enthusiasts who read too much during lockdown, have floated the idea of launching massive satellites into orbit to mimic the moon's gravitational pull. The goal? To generate artificial tidal forces in areas where the real moon's influence is too weak. It's pure theory right now, but imagine it. A network of lunar doppelgangers strategically placed to create custom tides for regions that need more water flow, more energy, or even flood prevention. The ethics of this are complicated. But the ambition? Chef's kiss. You walk a little farther and find a research outpost overlooking the bay. Inside, someone is running simulations of tidal lagoon systems, large circular pools built on coastlines that fill and drain with the tide to spin turbines. Unlike barrages, they can be designed to minimize environmental damage and even enhance marine habitats if done right. And because the tide is so reliable, predictable decades in advance, this type of power is considered one of the most stable renewable sources available. Wind might drop, clouds might cover the sun, but the moon doesn't cancel appointments. Still, it's not just about power. Some researchers are studying whether we could manipulate tidal flows to prevent coastal erosion. Imagine building offshore structures that nudge the tide into depositing sand on a beach rather than stealing it away. Like giving the ocean architectural feedback. Hey, maybe don't eat the boardwalk this year. The possibilities are intriguing, but the challenge is, they're huge. Tidal energy requires rugged equipment that can survive salt, barnacles, sediment, storms, and the occasional curious whale. It's expensive to build and maintain, and there's always the risk of disrupting local ecosystems, of changing the tide just enough to unbalance something delicate. Because that's the thing, we didn't design this dance. We're just the latest guests on the floor. The moon sets the rhythm, the ocean follows, we can hum along, maybe even add a harmony. But if we try to lead, the whole thing could fall apart. You stand now at the edge of a test platform. The tide is turning again, tugging at the base of a long submerged turbine. It spins slowly, obediently, effortlessly, driven by the same gravitational nudge that once flooded fields in Egypt and twitched the legs of trilobites. And you realise, we're not creating artificial tides. We're simply inviting the tide into our systems, building tools to catch it, to translate lunar gravity into something we can plug into the wall. It's not control, it's collaboration. The moon doesn't care if you charge your phone with its pull, the sea doesn't mind turning a few blades on its way out, but it will never be ours to own. We can harness it, but we can't command it. And maybe that's the lesson. Even in an age of satellites, smart grids and synthetic moons, the tide will always come and go on its terms. We're just smart enough to ride along. The turbine fades behind you now, its steady rotation disappearing beneath the incoming tide. You're walking again, this time on a path that winds along a rocky headland, waves crashing far below. The air smells of salt and wet stone. It's quieter here, demure, and as the sky turns a little more golden with the fading sun, you start to think about power. Not the kind that comes from control, but the kind that flows through things naturally. The tide moves mountains, or at least it erodes them, grain by grain. But lately we've been learning how to turn that motion into something even more immediate. Electricity. Welcome to the world of tidal power, where the moon fuels your light bulbs. You already know the basic idea. The tides rise and fall, so why not trap that motion and turn it into energy? Simple, right? And it is, on paper. But in practice, harvesting tidal energy is a bit like trying to catch a whisper with a wrench. The force is there, constant and predictable, but capturing it takes precision, patience, and the kind of technology that doesn't fall apart when soaked in brine and slapped by barnacles. Let's break it down. There are three main ways we harness tidal energy. 1. Tidal barrages. massive dam-like structures that trap and release tidal waters. 2. Tidal lagoons, circular or semi-enclosed pools filled and emptied by the tide. Tidal stream generators, basically underwater wind turbines. Each has its pros and cons. Barrages can generate a lot of power, but they also disrupt natural water flow and fish migration. Lagoons are gentler but expensive. Tidal stream generators are sleek and scalable, but still in development stages in many parts of the world. But here's the thing that makes tidal energy so seductive to scientists and engineers: it's incredibly predictable. Unlike solar or wind power, which fluctuate with weather, the tide always comes. You can predict it to the minute, decades or even centuries in advance. You could literally build a calendar powered by the moon. Oh wait, we did, it's called a tide table. There are already operational tidal power plants in several countries. La Rance in France, the OG tidal power station since 1966. Sihwa Lake in South Korea. A handful of smaller projects in Canada. The UK and China, each of these systems captures the kinetic energy of tidal currents or the potential energy of rising and falling water levels. And each has shown that the moon doesn't mind being used as a power source, so long as we are respectful. But scaling it up? That's the challenge. Right now, tidal energy makes up a tiny fraction of the world's renewable energy mix. Wind and solar dominate the headlines. They're cheaper, faster to install, and easier to explain at cocktail parties. It spins in the wind makes more sense than it spins underwater, because the moon is pulling the ocean sideways. Still weird, dear. Researchers and governments are investing. In Scotland, the Maygen project is deploying dozens of underwater turbines in the Pentland Firth, where tidal currents reach up to 5 meters per second, fast enough to power entire communities. In Canada's Bay of Fundy, they're experimenting with new turbine designs that can survive the region's famously brutal 50-foot tidal swings. Meanwhile, China is pushing forward with tidal barrage and lagoon designs to power parts of its dense coastal regions. And in Australia, remote communities are exploring microgrid systems powered by local tidal streams, offering energy independence where diesel generators once ruled. Let's throw in a fringe detail while we're here. There's a proposal floating around to use tidal energy on Mars. No joke, some space engineers speculate that if we ever settle on one of Mars' moons, likely Phobos, we might be able to use tidal flexing from Mars' gravity to generate power. It's theoretical, it's wildly impractical, and it sounds like the plot of a 1997 sci-fi novel. But hey, if it works here, why not elsewhere? Still, Earth is tricky enough. The biggest challenges to tidal energy aren't scientific, they're logistical. Saltwater is unforgiving, marine environments corrode metal, clog turbines with seaweed, and occasionally convince curious sea creatures to get a little too close. Maintenance is expensive, installation is slow, and public resistance is real. Coastal communities are protective of their water views, and environmentalists rightly worry about disturbing fragile ecosystems. But there's progress. Some of the newest designs are biomimetic, inspired by fish fins or whale tails moving gently with the tide rather than fighting it. These machines generate less energy per unit, but cause far less disruption. It's a new kind of thinking, not brute force, but cooperation. Historians still argue whether ancient societies dreamed of such things. Some point to the tide mills of medieval Europe as early evidence of this ambition. Others say those were isolated innovations, not precursors to energy grids. But even so, you can't look at a spinning wheel turned by the tide and not see the idea's bones. And now, the dream is bigger. What if we powered entire cities from the moon's pull? What if coastal towns battered by climate change and rising seas became tide-powered hubs of clean energy? What if the tide itself became the solution to the problems we caused? You pause now at a lookout, where an interactive map on a weathered plaque shows projected tidal power zones. Little lights flicker to show potential output. You press a button, and the display rewinds the tide. Forward, backward, like watching the heartbeat of the Earth on a loop. It's not science fiction anymore. It's just a question of scale, of will, because the tide doesn't wait, but it does return. And as you watch it sweep across the bay once more, you feel something ancient and new all at once. Gratitude for the moon, for the sea, and for the quiet, relentless energy that's always been there, just waiting to be caught. The air is thicker now, as if it's holding its breath. You've left behind the turbines and the smart barriers, the sleek metal limbs of modern engineering, and walked into something older, deeper. A coastline not marked by sensors or seawalls, but by stories. Here, the tide speaks a different language. It doesn't whisper in watts or kilowatt hours. It chants, it sings, it rises not just through sand and rock, but through myth. Because long before we measured tides with gauges and graphs, we told stories about them. Stories about gods, monsters, spirits, and silver wheels in the sky. Stories that tried to explain why the ocean moved the way it did, twice a day, every day, no matter how many prayers you said or sacrifices you left at the shoreline. Tonight, you're drifting into that world. The world of ancient myths and watery gods. Let's start where so many stories begin, with the moon. In many traditions, the moon isn't just a glowing object. It's a being, often feminine, often powerful, and often in charge of the water. In Hindu mythology, the moon is Chandra, a god of beauty and cycles, riding his chariot across the sky and controlling the tides through divine rhythm. In Maori legend, the moon is Hina, a goddess who tames the sea and guides fishers safely home. And in some Native American cultures, the moon is a grandmother who watches over the oceans, ensuring they never rest too long or rise too far. The idea that the moon and the tides are connected isn't a scientific revelation. It's a human intuition, one that's existed for as long as people have stood on the beach and wondered why the water came and went like breath. In Norse mythology, there's Ran, a sea goddess who collects drowned sailors in her net. The tides were seen as part of her will, rising to claim the unwary, retreating after she'd fed. Her husband, Aegir, brewed ale for the gods in a cauldron as wide as the sea. The couple didn't just live in the ocean, they were the ocean. And when the tide rose especially high, Vikings didn't curse the moon. They whispered that Ran was hungry. Move east to Japan and you'll find Ryujin, the dragon god of the sea, who ruled from a coral palace beneath the waves. His possession of the tide jewels, 2 magical orbs, gave him the power to command the ebb and flow of the sea. One jewel raised the tide, the other lowered it. Simple, elegant, effective, better than any hydraulic pump we've built. And in West African mythology, the Yamoja, or Yamaya, is the Orisha of the ocean, protector of motherhood, fertility, and, you guessed it, tides. Her moods influence the sea, her tears become rivers. When the tide swells, it's her embrace reaching the shore. Even the Greeks, with all their logic and geometry, couldn't resist mythologizing the ocean. Poseidon, god of the sea, could summon waves and earthquakes alike, his trident stirring the water like a giant spoon. The tides? Probably a side effect of his emotional roller coaster. Historians still argue whether ancient Greek philosophers fully grasped lunar influence on tides, but in the temples, the moon and the sea were always cousins at the very least. Let's drop in a fringe one for fun. Selene, the Greek goddess of the moon, was believed by some to be so in love with a mortal shepherd named Endymion that she put him into eternal sleep just so she could visit him every night. While the official myths don't directly link her to tides, later, folklore blends her longing with the sea's eternal motion. Each high tide a visit, each retreat a goodbye. The moon, after all, has always been seen as a romantic figure. Mysterious, distant, a little moody, kind of like the ocean. No wonder they get along. And what about monsters? You bet the tides got their fair share. In many cultures, sea monsters were used to explain rogue tides or unusually high floods. In Norse legend, Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent, was said to circle the earth beneath the sea. When he shifted, the tides responded. In some Pacific Islander stories, giant eels or turtles caused tidal surges, their movements stirring the ocean like a bowl of soup. There's also the enduring idea of the tide as judgment. In flood myths around the world, yes, even that flood, there's often a theme of water rising too far, of the sea reclaiming land it once allowed humans to borrow. In these tales, the tide isn't just a force of nature, it's a moral compass, an enforcer of balance. Now let's tiptoe into rituals. In ancient Egypt, the Nile's floods, driven into part by lunar and seasonal cycles, were celebrated with offerings to the god Hapi, guardian of the inundation. The river's rise and fall were not just observed, they were honoured. Life depended on them. In Celtic Britain, the tides phases likely guided certain druidic rituals. Sacred wells filled and emptied with the moon's rhythm, and the liminal space between high and low tide was seen as a thin place, a boundary between worlds. Some modern Wiccan traditions still time spells or meditations with the tide, casting at high tide to draw things in, at low tide to let things go. It's less about magic and more about aligning action with natural rhythm, something our ancestors understood without needing a double-blind study. Of course, science came along eventually and explained it all with mass, inertia, gravity and orbital mechanics. But the stories never stopped. Even now, you'll find sailors who speak of angry water just during spring tides, fishermen who swear by the moon's phase before casting their nets, children who name the waves and watch the water as if it might blink back. And maybe it will, in its own way. You sit now on a boulder near the tide line, watching the water creep higher with the coming night. The moon rises behind you, waning gibbous, quiet, proud, and for a moment you forget all the physics. You don't need Newton to tell you what the sea already knows. You don't need a satellite to understand what a grandmother once whispered while folding fishing nets at dusk. The tide comes, the tide goes, the moon calls, the sea answers, and we, strange creatures of logic and legend, keep telling stories. Because deep down, we know the truth. The tide doesn't just move water, it moves us. The moon is higher now, riding clean and silver above the waves, casting a path of pale light across the surface like a trail meant only for you. The tide is midway, neither full nor low. It's that restless transitional moment when the sea seems unsure of its next move, and you're standing in the calm eye of an ongoing debate. Because even with everything we know, gravity, rotation, bulges, lag, perigee, apogee, lunar nodal cycles, spring tides, neaps, there's still one truth we can't escape. Scientists are still arguing about the details. Yes, really. You'd think something as ancient and regular as the tide would be all figured out by now, filed neatly in the drawer labelled Settled Science, right next to the speed of light and why you always stub your toe on furniture. But the more closely you study the tides, the more slippery they become. Let's start with the basics. We do understand the core mechanism. The moon pulls on the Earth's oceans, the Earth spins, the oceans respond, the sun adds its influence, tides happen. That part, not under debate. But once you try to get precise, once you try to model every bay, estuary, coastal shelf and underwater ridge, well, that's when even the world's best scientists start side-eyeing each other during conferences. Take the lag of the tidal bulge. We know that the bulge of ocean water doesn't sit directly beneath the moon. It lags behind it a bit. That lag is due to friction between the moving water and the seafloor as well as the inertia of the water itself. But how much lag, exactly why, and how it varies depending on location, ocean depth and water temperature. That's still being actively modelled, with results that sometimes contradict each other. Then there's the matter of ocean resonance. Some ocean basins, like the North Atlantic, have natural frequencies that line up nicely with the lunar tidal cycle. That means the water sloshes in sync with the moon's pull, amplifying tides, but other basins, like the Pacific, have more complex interactions, resulting in messy, overlapping tidal patterns. Now, imagine trying to model every basin, every coastline, every underwater shelf and every continental slope to predict how the tide will behave everywhere all the time. That's what scientists at organisations like NOAA and International Hydrographic Offices are still working on. They use harmonic analysis, breaking tides into dozens of sinusoidal components, each representing a different celestial or geographical influence. Sounds neat and tidy, right? Sure. But some components are still being refined. New satellite altimetry data, like that from the TOPEX, Poseidon and Jason missions, continues to improve our understanding of how tides move globally, not just at individual tide stations. And yet, some parts of the tide remain weird. Historians still argue whether early tide watchers, like the Polynesian navigators, the Chinese court astronomers, or the Islamic scholars of the medieval caliphates, were actually better at predicting local tides than some modern models, not because they had better math, but because they had intimate long-term knowledge of local patterns, something that even supercomputers can't always replicate. Then there's Earth's crust, which, surprise, also experiences tides. These are called Earth tides or solid Earth tides, and they're caused by the same gravitational forces as ocean tides. The ground beneath you can rise and fall by up to 40 centimetres, about 16 inches each day. Not enough to send your latte flying, but enough to cause complications in GPS measurements, bridge engineering and even oil drilling. And no, scientists don't all agree on exactly how to model these either. Want another debate? let's talk about the long-term evolution of the Earth-Moon system. We know the Moon is drifting away, about 3.8 centimetres per year. That much is observable. But how fast has it been doing that over geologic time? That's where the models diverge. Some suggest the Moon started closer than previously thought. Others argue it's only been drifting at this rate for a relatively short time. Paleontologists have even gotten involved, using fossil corals to estimate the number of days in a year millions of years ago. More days equals shorter days equals faster Earth rotation equals closer Moon. It's part astronomy, part geology, part coral forensics. And guess what? The numbers don't always line up. Still not convinced scientists argue about tides? Try modelling tides on other planets. Jupiter's moon Io, for example, experiences massive tidal flexing due to Jupiter's gravitational pull, so much so that its surface literally stretches and cracks, causing volcanic eruptions. Some scientists argue this is an exaggerated version of Earth's own early history. Others say it's a completely different mechanism. And then there's Enceladus, another moon, this one orbiting Saturn. Its subsurface ocean, warmed by tidal forces, might be habitable or not. Depends on who you ask, depends on the model. Back on Earth, the debates continue at a smaller scale too. Marine biologists argue about how exactly tides influence spawning cycles in various fish and invertebrate species. Oceanographers still debate the best ways to model internal tides, underwater waves created by tidal flow interacting with seafloor topography. These waves can be hundreds of meters tall and travel thousands of kilometers, completely invisible from the surface. Let's add a fringe thought to this cerebral swirl. Some theorists, usually the speculative physics kind, have wondered if tides could be subtly affected by the gravitational waves, those ripples in space-time caused by massive cosmic events like black hole mergers. The idea is that the gravitational field of Earth could, theoretically, be wobbled in ways that ever so slightly shift tidal forces. Is there evidence for this? Not really. But it's fun to imagine a black hole 10 billion light-years away being the reason your beach toe eel got wet. You walk now along a quiet section of beach where someone has set up a handmade tide gauge, a stick poked into the sand marked with notches, a string of seashells tied around it. Primitive, yes, but effective. Because sometimes the simplest models are the most honest. You can calculate the tide, you can debate the lag, you can argue over nodal precession and Earth crust oscillations, but in the end, the sea still rises, the sea still falls, the moon still pulls, and we still guess we're clever, yes. We've made maps of invisible forces, launched instruments into orbit, written code to predict the water's next move, but we're also still standing on the shore with a stick in the sand, watching, wondering, waiting. Because for all our science and all our sensors, we're still learning the moon's language, and she's not done teaching us. You've wandered back to where it all began, near that same sleepy harbour, where the boats rock gently, and the air hums with the faint sounds of water brushing wood, rope creaking, and gulls arguing over dinner scraps. The tide is rising once again, as if it knows this part of the story needs to come full circle. The moon glows softly overhead, no longer a mystery, but still somehow just as magical. You know her secrets now, or at least some of them. You've walked through science and story, physics and folklore. You've been pulled by the same quiet force that stirs the oceans, tips the earth, and brushes your thoughts like a tide across your mind. This is your moonlight goodbye. The tide here isn't dramatic. It's modest, slow, familiar. It creeps in like an old friend returning without a word, just a knowing look and a bit of seaweed on its boots. You watch as the water lifts everything, the dinghies bob a little higher, the seaweed sways more gently, and your own breath seems to match the rhythm. It's a reminder that no matter how much changes, some things are beautifully, defiantly constant. Tides have always been there. Long before cities, long before clocks, long before humans even stood upright and decided to follow the moon with their eyes and their questions. And when we're long gone, when the satellites go quiet and the turbines stop spinning, the tide will still rise, the moon will still pull, the ocean will still answer. And yet, our time here has mattered. We've built homes, harbours and hope around the tides. We've tuned our calendars, our rituals, our mythologies to their song. We've studied them, feared them, surfed them, cursed them and thanked them. We've used the tide as a compass, a calendar, and now an energy source. The moon didn't ask to be part of our lives. She just kept orbiting. We're the ones who turned her gravity into poetry. Historians still argue whether the oldest surviving tide charts, scratched into stone, carved on wood, woven into oral tradition, were based on observation or worship. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe it doesn't matter. Because even if they didn't understand how it all worked, they knew it mattered. They felt it, just like you do now. As you sit near the edge of the dock, your toes dangling above the rising water, you feel that familiar tug again. Not just the tide under your feet, but something deeper, something older. The sense that you're connected to all of it. To the moon, to the ocean, to the tiny barnacle clinging to the side of a boat, to the sailor adjusting his lines for the changing depth, to the child building a sandcastle that will wash away before sunset. The moon moves the tides, but it moves us too. Let's slip in one last fringe idea. This one not from science, but from art. There's a belief whispered among certain dreamers and soft-eyed philosophers that the moon doesn't just influence the ocean, she listens to it. That the waves are a language, and the tides are a kind of prayer offered by the earth itself, twice a day, every day, in rhythm and reverence. Is that true? Doesn't matter. Because standing here, hearing the water lap against the shore in the dark, you almost believe it. You almost believe the sea is singing, and the moon, unchanging, unmoving, nods quietly in reply. You rise and take one last look at the water. It's higher now. The tide has done its work. The harbour holds more than it did an hour ago. So do you. You've followed the tide through history and myth, physics and faith, tragedy and triumph. You've walked with sailors and scientists, poets and engineers. You've listened to the sea's breath and the moon's whisper. And now, you leave with the tide still rising, not in chaos, not in fury, but in peace, because the moon is still watching, and the sea is still listening, and the tide is still coming home.